Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sergio Lugo. I am the author and host of this particular video, and the video focuses on the occupation airmail stamps of series of videos that we've produced on occupation stamps. And in this case, we chose to focus in on airmail stamps, both as end stamps, occupation stamps, and quasi-occupation stamps. The video is roughly 25 minutes long, with a question and answer session of about 15 to 20 minutes, together with an addendum of about 2 minutes of a 10-page downloadable inventory. For your information, the other 4 videos that have been presented and are available through YouTube focus in on worldwide occupations, Austria, Hungary, and Germany occupations, wishful thinking by nations in the way of nations, and airmails. Eventually, you will all see the videos on YouTube, and hopefully those process will be completed by the end of the year. Let's get started, shall we? You'll find that there's one huge difference between this video and the 4 others in our 5-part series. That is simply because you'll find that airmail occupations and quasi-occupations only begin occurring after 1925 and continue thereafter. That's simply because you didn't have much in the way of airmail transport before 1925. Occupation stamps, what are they? What we're talking about here are not the trades like workmen, carpenters, mechanics, or anything along that line. What we are talking about, and can generally be understood as wartime military use of postage in conquered lands. Some of the traits and characteristics of occupation stamps are that they are categorized by the alpha code N in the back of the book of Scott's catalogs. Usually, they are overprints of Victor stamps. Sometimes they are stamps of defeated and occupied areas. Also, you'll find that reprints of occupation stamps are possible. Sometimes occupation stamps are confused as independence issues, Cinderellas, or provisionals with a large P. Sometimes occupation stamps are unavailable in occupied areas, but sometimes they are also only available in the occupying nation's post offices. And finally, I'd just like to mention to you that occupation stamps are not necessarily in the sole prerogative or purview of imperial powers. Sometimes they are used by minor powers or minor nations as a result of wars that they engage in with their neighbors. One such example is for Chile during the War of the Pacific with Peru. Provisional issues are considerably different, but in reality, many are indistinguishable from N category stamps. Remember, the N category is issued by Scott's under a trademark that they've got and available only under those Scott's brand. Other catalogs do list occupation stamps, but don't necessarily assign codes to them. What are the traits and characteristics of provisional or quasi-occupational stamps? Provisional is used as a catch-all phrase for a host of stamps that are issued by nations, including definitives, semi-postables, postage due, military stamps, and that are akin to provisionals. They are not necessarily what a common statement oftentimes says, and that statement is, if it walks and quacks like a duck, it must be a duck. That is not necessarily so with respect to occupation stamps. I do refer to provisionals as quasi occupation stamps on many occasions during the discussion. As I've already suggested to you, they are not N-alpha code stamps according to Scott. They are often overprinted, and they can be used during wartime or peacetime. As already mentioned, they are most frequently found in listings of occupied areas and nations, but collectors need to know the circumstances of issues of such quasi or N category stamps. You should be aware of the fact that they are not issues for colonies, offices abroad, or initial independence. What we've had shown for a couple of seconds now is an example of a Manchukuo stamp that was used by a puppet government that it was at the control of the Japanese in portions of China during the 1930s. I'm going to use Germany to help jumpstart the discussion relative to occupation versus provisional or quasi-occupational issues. It can become very confusing as to the use of N stamps by the German Republic. The number of definitives of the German Republic were overprinted and used, and they seemingly look like just German stamps when in fact they are occupations. They were issued and publicized and distributed by puppet regimes set up by the German Reich, including such places as Bosnia and Herzegovina and the general government of Poland in the period 1939 to about 1943. There were as well stamps that were N occupation stamps that were issued for occupied nations by the German Reich. And so you do have this bouncing around a little bit of provisional versus occupation. Here we have an illustration of a page from the inventory of occupation and quasi-occupation stamps that is appended to the end of this presentation. That inventory is downloadable and available to you. It was compiled by me as the author and the host of this, and any mistakes in it are mine. If you find any, you're welcome to let me know, or if you find some additions that I should have, please, you're welcome to let me know. On this particular slide, you'll see that you've got, beginning with Germany, East Africa, and we've got that bifurcation between N issues and provisional issues. And there are no provisional issues involved with Germany, East Africa. But we do have N issues on the part of Belgium, which used Belgian Congo definitives as N stamps in Germany, East Africa in the period 1916 to 1922. You'll also find that Great Britain occupied Germany, East Africa during the first and waged a 4-year war against German forces. Among those forces are the naval scenes and the naval theme of the Humphrey Bogart and Katharine Hepburn movie, of the early 1950s entitled
The African Queen.
The African Queen. Thank you, Gary. I threw a blank on that in a minute, okay? But getting back now to the stamps themselves. Great Britain used Nyasaland and East Africa Uganda definitives as N issues in 1916 to 1918. Great Britain also used German East Africa, Zanzibar, and Indian Expeditionary Force definitives as N stamps for Mafia Island as N's in the period 1915-1916. Mafia Island being a part of German East Africa. At the right, you'll see a stamp that looks like an occupation stamp, but is in reality a revenue stamp, and it was not an occupation stamp. Picking up again. Let's now focus on Germany. You see on the picture on the right an envelope which is occupational in nature only by a real extension of your mind. Okay? What had transpired here, ladies and gentlemen, was that Germany had annexed Austria in 1939. Germany did not bother with occupation stamps or with the issuance of occupation stamps, but decided on using a definitive of Germany to show the forced merger of the two countries, which was released in 1939. This particular example was from Grau, from the town of Grau in the former Austrian nation that had been occupied. With respect to Belgium, German definitives were used as N stamps for Belgium in the period 1914 to 1918. Germany also used, in the case of France, French definitives as N issues in Alsace-Lorraine in 1870, and again in 1940 with the onset of the Second World War. German definitives were also used for France proper in the period of the First World War in the year 1916. Great Britain was occupied partially by Germany with the German onslaught of 1940, when Germany succeeded in taking over and capturing the islands of Guernsey and Jersey and as the Channel Islands, and they used German definitives as N stamps for those British Isles in the period 1940 to 1942. German definitives of 1933 were used by Germany, as well as semi-postals in the period of 1940 to 1941 in the case of Luxembourg. And lastly, German definitives as well as semi-postals were used heavily by Germany in the case of Russia in the period after World War II, between 1944 to 1949. Finally, I'm going to mention to you the fact that there were many jurisdictions involving Germany occupations or related provisionals in places like we've already mentioned: Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Estonia, Macedonia, the Marshall Islands, New Britain, the Northwest Pacific Islands, and Poland, and many others. One of the things that you as you as viewers and students of this subject should keep in mind is that there are red flags involved in occupations and quasi-occupation stamps. As we have already noted previously, the graphics are intended to show the effort to squeeze in to small circles and small squares a variety of things, and some of them don't fit the sizes. These red flags include such things as the provisionals are frequently definitives of home countries, and we've talked about that before. Provisionals in the sense of lowercase usage exist for a variety of stamps akin to occupation stamps. You should bear in mind that collectors frequently fail to distinguish between end stamps and so-called provisionals or quasi-occupations. In the case of quasi-occupations or non-end stamps, we might be talking about what are known as K stamps for treaty ports. We might be talking about offices. We might be talking about a host of other things that are not provisional or quasi-provisional in nature. And you'll see those as we talk about some of these. It is not clear to me, as the author and host of this, as to why Scots codifies certain stamps as occupations, whereas other stamps that are clearly occupational in nature and may be overprinted as occupations by an occupying country are not coded as end stamps. It is totally baffling, and it becomes extraordinarily difficult to distinguish in such arenas as military stamps that are used and published and printed and postmarked from occupied areas, but are not listed as end stamps. The same is true, for example, involving AMG Allied military government stamps of the joint powers in post-World War II, with a number of areas of Germany and Austria. Finally, you should be aware of the fact that there are stamps that you'd swear were occupation and are not. And we're talking about here treaty port stamps, or stamps that are designated as K stamps by Scots. In passing, let me note to you that I never got a response from AMA's publication for why Scots catalog definitions of N category stamps of what they were. ML occupation or quasi-occupational stamps are difficult to find or identify. Many were issued in very small numbers in the post-1925 years. The 19 jurisdictions below had such stamps and are identified in Scots catalogs as variants of Scots C codes. These 19 jurisdictions are identified in the 16 scans of the inventory of worldwide occupations by the Scots Code C or NC or MC, and are illustrated, if possible, from examples in my collection or stock. Memel and Mesopotamia were originally in this list, but due to misunderstandings on my part, the list was removed, but the explanation of the discrepancy exists on the scan that we get to. So what are we looking at? Hong Kong, Palestine, Montenegro, Syria, and the United States. We're not going to go through all of them, but we're going to fill you in a little bit on each one of these countries. Kuwait is one of the countries that we've mentioned in the list. And it is, as you can see here, under the category of provisional or quasi-occupational airmail stamps. Following World War I, Kuwait was under British protection until 1961, when it became an independent state. In the years 1923 through 1958, Iraq, Indian, and Great Britain Postal Administration stamps were overprinted for use in Kuwait. Air Post stamps of India were overprinted Kuwait in the period 1933 to 1934 and are listed by Scots as C stamps, but are in fact quasi-occupational issues. With regard to memo, its inclusion as an airmail occupation was a misread on my part of the Lithuanians regarding the seizure of Klaipėda memo in 1923. These kinds of misinterpretations can in fact happen all over the place, and any collector of this material has got to be very careful about some of those mistaken attributes. The same thing was true for Mesopotamia. No airmail stamps were ever issued for Mesopotamia, with official, that is, O stamps, mistaken by me for quasi-occupational issues. Hong Kong was occupied by the Japanese in 1942, but not relinquished until 1945. Occupation stamps were issued in 1945, but none were airmail. In the example being shown here, we're showing a cover from the Showa year 28, in this case 1943. This is a very unusual cover, and I'm not sure if airmail was involved here. I haven't been able to determine that yet. We're illustrating here a postal card which suggests usage as a piece of quasi-occupational postal history. Written by a Portuguese citizen who probably was from Macau between 1943 and 1945. It was released during that period. The Ionian Islands. These Greek islands were occupied first by the Italians in 1941, and Scott lists them as numbers NC1 to NC12. Then, in 1943, the Germans occupied the islands and issued one stamp numbered NC13. In this case, we're talking about Italy. And if you're wondering why everything is spread out all over the scan, that's because it's spread out all over the scan, folks. It's a particularly difficult nation to study with respect to occupational airmails or quasi-occupational stamps. A review of the back of the book of the Scots catalog listings reveals the difficulty, but this is not the place to explore those problems. Suffice it to say that military air post stamps, that is Scott numbers MC1 to 5, as well as military air post special delivery stamps, that is Scott number MCE1, were issued in 1943. And these can be viewed as quasi-occupational airmail in nature. On the other hand, in the case of the Italian Social Republic and Venezia Giulia, occupation air post stamps listed in Scots as 1 LNC1 to 7 were released in the years 1946 and 1947. If you're looking for an explanation from me as to why the British and the Americans did that, I have no reason and I don't understand why they did this. Finally, we're going to talk about SAW in Germany at the same time on this particular page, in this particular scan. You'll see in both instances that the stamps are identified as provisional or quasi-provisional in nature. In the case of the SAW, following World War II, SAW was occupied by the French. A single French quasi-occupation airmail semi-postal issue was released in 1948, and it is Scott number CB1. This was issued as a single and as a souvenir sheet. Valuations for used examples are quite high, and in the case of the souvenir sheet, are approaching $12,000. In the case of Germany, once Germany invaded Russia in 1941, the vast expanses captured by the Germans required the development of a military air post system that had to travel thousands of miles throughout Russia. That service on the part of the German military continued until 1944. I am uncertain as to whether civilians were permitted to use that system. We'll start by talking about some that were published by Italy. A total of 11 stamps were issued by Italy between 1938 and 1940 for its occupation of Albania during that time period. These stamps, however, are quasi-occupational in nature, despite the evident overprint of Italian origin on these Albanian stamps. You'll see in this example about three of them are clearly marked Italian occupation, while the remainder are just simply figures or figures related to Italy that were used in the case of Albania. Next one is one that is provisional in nature, and that involves the canal zone. What you could see in here is an example of a regular definitive for the canal zone that was overprinted in the period 1929 to 1931. In the case of the canal zone, there were 5 such stamps, airmail stamps, that were used as quasi-airmail during this time period. And the reason they were being used as quasi-airmail is because the status of the zone had never been settled until 1929-1930 period. The United States had taken over the area as a building project from the Panama Canal Company, which was French-owned. Eventually, they determined that an area had to be expanded to accommodate all of the water that was being built up and stored for operation of the canal, and that became a 10-mile zone on either side of 5 miles on either side of the Chagres River. The Panamanians had never agreed to that, and the United States was left in the predicament of having built the canal and trying to get the Panamanians to agree, and they eventually agreed as the Panamanians increased their financial demands on the United States. That area and those issues were not settled until 1929, 1930, and that agreement eventually provided for the cessation of United States control over the canal zone, which occurred in the turn of the 21st century. Another example is China. China used seven Chinese definitives as NC coded stamps in China in 1941. Here you have an example, namely number 9NC1. There were no quasi-occupational airmails used by Japan in China during this time period. An interesting exception, an interesting occupation issue was that of the island of Corfu. Corfu is in the Aegean Sea. The Greeks had taken over the islands and used 12 Greek definitives as airmail stamps in 1941. There were no quasi-occupational issues, airmail issues, issued by the Greeks for these islands. One of the things that you should be aware of is that the regular issues of Corfu were extensively counterfeited, and in my mind, there are probably counterfeited Corfu airmails as well. Italy had seized Libya from the Ottomans in 1912, ruling it as a colony until 1939, when it was annexed to Italy. The Mussolini Hitler head airmails shown here are quasi-occupational in nature. In addition, Italy used 7 Cyrenaica airmail definitives as quasi-occupational airmail stamps for Libya during this time period of the 1940s. Following World War II, France took possession of Libya using an occupational air post and coded stamp from 1946 to 1951. These were Faison definitives. Now, before you all start asking me, I'm not going to sit there and try and explain Faison. Let me just say to you that Faison was an area administered by the Free French during World War II, and that became their springboard for taking over Libya in 1942 and 43. Manchukuo. Manchukuo is otherwise known as Manchuria, and Japan had seized Manchuria from China in 1932 at the onset of the Sino-Japanese War that continued for 15 years. The puppet government established by Japan used 4 Manchurian definitives as quasi-occupational airmails in 1936 to 1937. With the collapse of Manchukuo, there were a number of stamps that were turned into quasi-occupational stamps by China. And I've got examples in blocks of 4 for about 15 to 20 such stamps. I should mention to you that these are virtually unknown and are only contained in a footnote at the end of Manchuria to describe these stamps. There is no physical presentation or representation of the stamps themselves. Continuing on, we're going to talk about United States quasi-occupational stamps. In previous videos, we've noted that the United States never issued N-coded stamps for any of the areas that it administered during wartime, well, after the war. One of those areas was the Ryukyus, which basically were administered by the United States between 1945 in 1977, when the Ryukyus reverted back to Japan. In the period 1945 to 1949, the United States administered the Postal Service using definitives that it printed and distributed in the Ryukyus. In 1940, in the period from 1949 to 1953 or 54, there were additional stamps that were issued that were approved and agreed upon between the United States and the Ryukyu government. Two examples are shown here of quasi-occupational airmail stamps that were used in that period between 1945 and 1954, and they just were used for airmail purposes, even though they were not categorized as end stamps. This concludes my presentation on occupation or quasi-occupational airmail stamps of the world. As you can see, they were few and far between, and we'll try and add more if we can. A comments and questions and answers section follows from the individual 5 presentations developed after this subject matter was presented to Denver area clubs. The complete worldwide inventory follows each of the separate presentations. Revisions to the corrections to the inventory are welcome. For your information, this is a specialty program developed by Sergio Lugo and recorded by Gary Withrow before second Saturday audiences comprised of Airmail students in the Denver area. And thank you for sharing your time and attention with us. We hope you have a good day. I'll open it up now to questions and comments and answers and discussion points that you would all like to raise. Okay? If you don't want to, we just cut it short. We don't extend it any longer than we have to. Okay? But this is a general gist of all of the 5, and this is the way we present them for all 5 of them. One to have that uniform presentation in front, and then the focus on the specific theme of that particular presentation. John, before you continue, would you mind repeating the question you asked of me earlier with regard to the, the islands?
Canary Islands.
Canary Islands. Would you mind repeating it just for the...
I asked you if you were going to be covering those, and I didn't think you were. Okay. They are not technically occupation stamps, but they are sort of local provisionals.
Yes. Yes.
And I don't quite, I'm trying to remember what the Scots numbering is. I think it is LN, but I'm not sure.
Okay. Totally. Basically, come on, local issues.
Well, L is the local.
Yeah, the local issues.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't remember the N being in there.
I can't remember.
Okay.
There's 9C or something.
There's that. You're right. There are also C's.
Yeah, there's C's. No problem. Gotcha.
And that's I have no problem with that either.
Yeah. But that's the reason I didn't include it, because I didn't view it as an occupation or quasi-occupation.
Yeah,
now what we have to come back. What we have to come back to here is the issue of how do we each perceive these things as whether they're occupation or not. And if I didn't see any military aspects during the wartime, I didn't include it. Okay.
Well, I don't think of them as occupation stamps, but they are military in a sense.
Yes, they can be.
Because of the fact that Lufthansa they were issued for Lufthansa to carry the mail after World War II, the Spanish Civil War.
Yeah, there was a Spanish Civil War.
Yeah, they were issued in 36, beginning in 36 through about 39.
Now, you know what I can do is I can go back and look at this, and I will look at it because we presented the issue. And I'll look at, no, I don't mind responding to people's questions and issues, and if I can't definitively say so,
Yeah.
I'm not gonna commit one way or the other, but this is the purpose of the discussion here. Go ahead, anybody else? Anybody else that would like to
I
propose
have
something?
another
Yes, John?
question. This is sort of trivial thing.
No, no,
You
no.
talked about the SAR and you said that there was a CB1 in France.
Yeah.
Is that an issue listed under France or listed under SAR?
It's unlisted under SAW.
Okay, that's why
I was shocked when I saw it.
Yeah.
I was going through the catalog the second time. This was on Tuesday night, and he's waiting for me to get everything to them. And I'm sitting there trying to go through 4 remaining catalog. I'm going through. And you can quickly go through them. I said, what the hell is this? I saw it, and then I saw the price. And I said, God almighty, this was a souvenir sheet for CB1. Not, it's a definitive. Okay, it's an Airmail, but it's not.
Airmail semi-postal.
Airmail semi-postal, but it's not treated as an occupation, but it is a quasi-occupation. I fell over. Did I say 24,000?
12.
12,000. I fell over when I saw that souvenir sheet.
Yeah.
Any of you got them?
But that's the thing, because as you know, I collect France, and if that had been a French issue, I would have certainly been aware of it. Whether I managed to acquire it or not is a different matter.
Yeah.
But I didn't think it was French, because I didn't like.
Okay, that was a subject that apparently came up this morning with someone mistaking a French issue from 1905, a souvenir sheet that he had picked up for pennies, who knows when, and someone pointed out to him, Paul pointed out to him, it was worth $2,400.
No, 1,200.
1,200.
He doubled it.
Yeah. He's a dealer.
Double it before you tell him the price.
Yeah.
Who else? Steve had an example earlier today that we'll insert, and it dealt with another on-piece example of the canal zone quasi airmails. Okay, it showed the green stamp and it showed that time period, 1929. I was just delighted to see it, and I asked Steve to make sure that we got it, and we said it would be okay to include that. So this will be illustrated, in the Q's and A's. Okay. Unfortunately, you don't have that many, and I didn't think we would even have this long a discussion on Q's and A's and comments on these, the Airmail ones. When we first started revising it, about a week or so ago,
Yeah.
we only had about 13, and I said, okay, I gotta find some more.
This is an Airmail club, what do you expect?
No, yeah, but I didn't want to give you just a 2-minute presentation. And I'm sorry I had to explain everything again at the beginning, about it, but that was just necessity here. I'm gonna try one more time to get anything from any of you guys as to what you'd like to add or contribute in the way of any comments. And if not, I'll just go ahead and end it now. Anybody?